Hi, I'm Tony Allen Bernier, and in this video I'm going to show you how to digitize your patterns. While some programs can be a little bit more technical, we're going to be using a nice user-friendly drawing program. We'll be covering how to make them printable on one large piece of paper, like at Office Max, or if you have a company print them for you, or we'll make them printable on your home printer with the cut lines and all that kind of stuff. We'll also cover how to add some watermarks, how to put the printable template on there to kind of guide everybody through the process. If you just want to make these for friends, easy shareability, or if you want to make them to sell, make them real professional looking, we'll cover everything you need to know. I've been digitizing patterns and doing this for quite some time now, and I figured out some pretty cool tricks and just streamlined the whole process, and I'll show you exactly how to do that. To get this program, you can just Google or do a search for Clip Studio Paint. It can go by other names, Clip Studio Paint Pro, Magna Studio Paint. I've seen it throughout the years. They kind of mess with the name a little bit, but they're all the same program. So that Clip Studio Paint, I believe, is what they're calling it right now when I go in to download their newer versions. Before we really dig into this process, let's just go over some of these tools real quick. I will mention how they work and stuff during the whole process, but just to familiarize yourself with this program, first thing I'll mention is over here is all the tools. And then as soon as you click on a tool, it gives you the sub-tool categories. For instance, this is a pen, and it gives you different types of pen, each of which has different functions to some degree, and a lot of this stuff can really be dialed in to do different things. You can customize a lot of this too. The eraser, or like an airbrush, most of what we're going to be using is this selection tool to grab certain things, move them around and stuff. And the other tool we'll be using mostly is the figure tool, which is like lines, a polyline, boxes, and circles and things like that. I'll go over more of the brush size and all these little functions as we're going into the process here. Color wheel down here, we can grab and drag this wherever we want, and there's different tabs, different types of color wheels and graphs and things you can use. And over on the side here, once we open a file, I'm just going to open one quick to show you these layers on the side here, and what these layers do, and you can click this button and keep adding more layers. Every single layer is like a piece of transparency film. So the first layer is just the background color, and if we go to this one here, and let's just grab the box and make some boxes, so that's going to be on this layer, and these little eyes on the side, you can turn on and off each layer if you want to see it or not. So that comes in handy too when we're just trying to make templates and things to line stuff up, and we can just get rid of it when we want. And then if we go up to the next layer, make some red boxes, but let's come down to the brush size and increase it a bit. So each layer is separate from the other. This hand tool here, you click and hold, and you can move everything around. And then to move just your layer around, you'll go down one tool to the operation tool, and when you're on this layer, you have to make sure you grab what's on that layer, and you can move it around. And you can combine these layers as well by right-clicking, and you can flatten image, which puts them all together, or merge with the layer below it, so now those two layers became a single layer. So that's basically the gist of it. All of these are some really fancy tools that I don't really ever use either. That's more for artists and things that do a lot of comic books and character design and stuff like that. So let's just close this file. Some printers only print so big. Most of the time, if you're going online, you can just select exactly how big, so it's not as crucial. However, if you bring it to Office Max, sometimes they'll only have two printers. One is only 26 inches wide, one is quite a bit wider. But what I like to do is just start with a pretty large page. That way it's easier for me to just narrow it down if I need to. and always save that Clip Studio file that we're making right here, because then you can always bring it in. What we want to do is make a Clip Studio file that we can just open and then import any pattern into that we had scanned, so that we have that always ready to go. We don't want to make this page over and over again. So let's do this template and save it as the Clip Studio file. And the first thing we need to do is come up to File here, click New. I always like to go pretty big because it's easy, once the pattern's in there and everything, just to bring those edges in and resize it. But if you have a large pattern and there's not enough space on there, then you have to open it up and draw more lines, and it's kind of a hassle. So 55 inches width by 65 inches height is going to be plenty of space. Resolution, I almost always go with 144. You might notice when you zoom in, it gets a tiny bit pixelated. You can start at 300, which I do 300 for tooling patterns, but then I still decrease it down later on. It just allows me to get them a little bit nicer looking, and then I bring it down. Otherwise, the size of the file can get too big. So for construction patterns, let's leave it at 144. For tooling patterns, you can set that to 300. There are different project type stuff up here for different artists, different techniques. We just want to stay on this illustration tab here. And come over to the unit of measurement. Make sure you're on the correct one. 55 inches width, 65 height. You can change the color of the paper background, that first layer. I'm just going to leave it white. Hit OK. So that's our page. Now, it's a specific size, and we can save it as a JPEG and convert it to a PDF, and it will maintain that size and print that size. In order to put our template down on this page, and we'll cover all the math for standard US printers, and the rest of the world, I believe, is mostly the A4 printers. So we'll cover those two, and I will get all the answers for you on here as well if math isn't your strong suit. But I'll pull up a file here so that you do have the technique, how to work through this process if you want to make it specific for any printer that you might have. So here's all the math. And you'll remember earlier, this hand tool, you can select to move your file around. But instead of having to go to that hand tool all the time, you can just hold down your space bar and it automatically has that tool ready to go for you. So you don't have to keep coming over here to select it. And there's a lot of hotkeys. I won't be going through a lot of them. I'll let you handle that if you want to increase your workflow. I want to go slow and make sure we get every tool figured out for you here. The mouse wheel can scroll in and scroll out, and we'll be scrolling in and scrolling out quite a bit to dial in measurements and things like that. So this page, if you want to pause it, take a look at this. Our answers are down here, so this is what we're going to be going by. But this is the whole process. I didn't want to verbally go through this because that could get confusing, and I'm sure I probably would have messed it up. So that's that. And this is our file. So in order to get the measurements correct, we need to go up here to View, and we're going to come down to Grid. And that turned on our grid, but usually the measurements on the grid aren't correct. We have to go back to View up here again. Grid Rule Bar Settings. And now we can set it. And it looks good, close. This is our gap, and it tells us our unit of measurement next to it. So you can check again to make sure it's set to the right unit of measurement. And if it's not, I'll show you how to fix that in a second here. Our gap is going to be 1 inch. Number of divisions, we want 8 because we're working at 1/8 of an inch. And that set it up for us. So if you zoom in, each one of those boxes is 1 inch, and they're divided 8 times for 1/8 of an inch segments. So let's say that unit of measurement was wrong. You need to come back to Edit and change canvas size. Now we're not going to actually change the canvas size right now, but this is where you come in and change the unit of measurement if you need to. And if you do, you probably want to go back into view grid rule settings and make sure the segments are set up correctly. So now that we have our measurements, the first is 7 3/8 inches wide. I'm going to be doing the standard US measurements. And instead of going through and trying to space each line exactly 7 3/8 inches apart, I make a little box template. But first, before I do that, let's come over to this section here and make a layer that we can use for templates and things so that stuff doesn't get overlapped. It'll always give us that freedom to combine things later. Just call it cut line template or something. Make sure you selected that layer. I'm going to go to red. Usually when I do templates and things, I'll bring this up into red or just a different color other than black so that it stands out and I can see that, you know, one layer is still turned on before I set everything up or print or anything like that. And then we'll come in and just grab any box, and we'll start on one of the corners here for our measurement, just within the border of this file. But what tool I like to use, you would think usually you'd want to come down to the figure tool here and just do a box. But the problem with a lot of these tools is they're a click and hold, and when you release, it lets those lines down. And unfortunately, you can't zoom in and zoom out and position yourself really well if you're doing it that way. So I usually come up to polyline. This polyline tool allows me just to click, and then I can move around, zoom in, zoom out, find where I want to click again to set the next point of that line. Come down, line fill. It's usually always on create line here. You can, however, fill in the box if you want. The brush size 5 is usually pretty good. If you're starting with 144 DPI for your file, that works really well. You might need to up it 1 or 2, 6 or 7. That's basically the DPI of the brush itself. If you are starting at 300 DPI for your file, you might want to up that a couple notches, otherwise the line gets a little bit thin. Opacity, make sure that's still up at 100%. If we want to later, we can come back and decrease opacity of any one of these layers with this dial here. The anti-aliasing, this just kind of blurs the edges a little bit. This first one's going to be real pixelated. I usually keep it right here, medium. Usually ends up looking pretty good. But for the sake of this box, we can go up a little bit so that we'll see the lines a little bit better. It really doesn't matter. You'll see in a sec why. But first thing I want to do is I zoom way in and get my cursor right on that corner. One click, and we started our line. And you'll see with every click, it sets a new point. Now, if you set a point wrong, you can just right click and it'll back you up one click. You'll also notice here, this comes in handy. Instead of trying to dial this in and stay on the line, if you hold shift, it'll keep that line straight on either a 45 or a straight. So we'll measure this out first. And we want to go again 7 3/8. 1, 2. So if I'm on 7, I can zoom in and I know that cursor is always going to stay on that 7. I'll hold the space bar down to bring that hand tool up, click and drag, and position it so I can see clearly where I want to go next. 3/8. 1, 2, 3. So I'll zoom in again and make sure I get that cursor right on that line. And I suggest holding shift down so that it locks on that straight. Click right in that corner again. And you can check. That's 3/8, so the rest should be 7 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 3/8. Now we have to go down 9 3/4 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we can hit this space bar to bring the hand tool up, and that cursor will stay right on the 7, 8, 9 inches. and 3/4. So we'll zoom in and keep that cursor right on the 9. 3/4 is basically 6/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be 3/4. Again, I'm holding shift down right there. It locks it in. I'm going to zoom in first and make sure I get right on that line, right in the corner. Click. Zooming out. Again, that mouse wheel comes quite handy. So we can just eyeball this one. We can see that main line we started on. So we can just eyeball it and come in close. We know we got to go right to this line here. Hold shift. Right on that line. It's so much easier being able to zoom in and out while we're placing these lines. And it will automatically lock onto that first point we started. But sometimes if you're off just a little bit, which we probably aren't, but just for safety's sake, I like to go past that and then hold shift and double click just to make sure it's real straight coming up from the bottom there. And we have some extra lines here. You can leave them. You can get rid of them to clean it up. So what I do in that situation is there's a couple ways you can use this eraser tool, but you have to mess with the settings a little bit and it can be a little harder to get it right where you want that line to be. Works fine, but I like to come up to this selection tool here, select the rectangle, and click and drag to select this area, and I'll bring it right up to that line. Let go, and then if you hit backspace or delete, everything within the confines of that box will be deleted. So we can do it again with this little nub sticking out on that side. Now we have a template set up. We're going to use this to lay our cut lines down. We're going to come over and make another roster layer, double click that layer, and we're going to call it cut lines. In order to use this template we made now, we don't want to be on the cut lines layer. We want to come down to the template layer. And we're going to select it with the selection tool, which again, if you ever need to know what tool I'm on, if something gets mixed up, you can just come over here and check this bar. That's highlighted, and then the sub tool will be highlighted. We'll click Scale Rotate. You can click these little boxes, rotate it, scale it differently. We'll use a lot of that layer. For now, we're just going to grab in the center and bring it up to the corner of the page here. And even with that selected and moving around, you can still click and hold space to bring that hand tool up. And get it right up to those edges. And you can zoom in and use the arrow keys on your keyboard to fine tune this. And that's laid down for our template. Switch back to the cut lines layer. And if for some reason you can click and drag and hold and move these layers, if for some reason your cut lines layer is underneath that template, I suggest grabbing that, pulling that up, and placing that tab above the cut line template. Otherwise it will be behind it and you won't see it. The other option is to turn the opacity down on your cut line template page. Either way works. So the tool we want to use will be over here, the figure tool, and we're going to use that polyline tool again. We'll leave the brush size to 5, that's pretty good. If you want to up it a little bit, you can, so the cut lines are a little bit wider. Opacity, leave at 100%. A little bit of anti-aliasing is good. Doesn't matter a whole lot. If you go all the way up here, it could look a little bit jagged, especially for curves and things like that. But for a straight line, it usually doesn't make much of a difference at all. The only thing we're going to change really is this brush shape. We want to click the tab on brush shape and come down to the dashed line. Make sure we're on black, and then we'll zoom in to where we're going to start this line and click right in the center of that line up top here. Like I said, with this tool we can zoom in and zoom out before we lay that next position. So we'll zoom all the way out, and we're not going to just go to the bottom of this box. We're going to go all the way past the edge of the paper here and hold Shift so it locks it in that straight. Double click. That's our first line. Now we'll do one horizontally here. Zooming in with the mouse wheel, click right in the center of that line, and you can see that our template isn't right on those measurement lines, but if you remember before, we left ourselves a good amount of leniency. So we will be just fine. Zoom out with the mouse wheel, hold space so I can click and grab and move this over. And then wherever your cursor is when you zoom in, it will zoom into that area. We'll hold Shift. It's not even on the page. Let's see, where are we? There it is. Holding Shift, that's the straight line across. Double click. That's our second line. Now we need to move that template over a little bit. So first we'll need to come back over here, click that layer, come to our selection tool. It's still on the rectangle. Click and drag, grab that box, scale rotate button there, and grab and drag it into the next position. So now we're just going to be looking at this point here. We want to leave, and again, back to the arrow keys on the keyboard to fine tune it. Get it so those lines are right in the center again. Hit OK. Deselect that area. Back out. And switch back to the cut lines layer. We're going to place our next cut lines. It's before the figure tool. Polyline. All these settings should still be good to go. Right in the center. Holding Shift to lock that line. Double click. Perfect cut line all the way down. So just continue on. Get all your vertical lines in, then grab that box, move it down, get all your horizontal lines in, and then you will end up with something like this. And we have our full page done here. Now I stopped a little bit early, but like I said, you're always better off going too big than too small. If you stop early like I did and decide that's going to be enough space, that's quite a few pages. If you want to shrink this down a little bit, you'll come up to Edit, change canvas size. And this actually doesn't change the scaling at all, just the size of the page. And instead of trying to dial in these numbers, you can just grab this little box down here, click, drag it up. Okay. Before we go on with this, let's just make sure we have it saved so we don't lose any of our progress. Come up to File, Save As, Pattern Template, that works. And we want to make sure we leave it in Clip Studio format. That way it maintains all these separate layers so we can always come back, change stuff around if we need to. So for instance, if you have your pattern situated and you have it set up for paged, you can just open the main big file for that pattern, click that one layer off for the cut lines, and then you already have it ready to go for a large format printing. You just have to PDF it, and we'll cover that in the end. Save that just so we're good to go. So next, import your scans. If you hadn't already scanned it, most scanners are pretty easy, user-friendly. Pop them in there. And like I said earlier, some you can put larger pages in than just the standard page. If you're trying just to get a little bit more space, you can tape a couple pages together or something if you need to. Or what I like to do for anything real big, just bring it into Office Max. I'll trace it on a big tablet of paper. I got a huge tablet from Amazon. Works pretty good. Chances are you'll have something like this. If it's a tooling pattern, more than likely it'll be already just drawn on a piece of paper, which you can just scan, and the rest of the process is the same. With stuff like this, clearly this is a little bit bigger than a standard page, and you can use large format scanners. And what I did is I purchased a really large tablet of paper on Amazon. I can trace pretty large things, and the scanners at the office supply store can scan that. Here's a couple things traced out already that I'll be scanning on my home scanner. If you're going to be doing larger patterns on your home scanner, what I'll do is splice these. When I'm splicing something, I'll take a page just to get an idea of where I want to go. Right in half should be good. And you'll draw a line across it, but make it kind of awkward so that these two parts later on can be matched back together, no problem. And you'll cut this. And what we'll do is trace each half of this pattern and then put them back together in the program. If your patterns are symmetrical and you have a center point, mark that. That can come in handy later on. That way we only have to trace and refine half of this pattern. Just flip it over. With all your parts traced, go back and just make sure every page has a 1-inch line for reference. Now we're ready to bring in our scanned images, and what you want them to be is in JPEG format. If you didn't ask Office Max or wherever you brought them into in a large format to save them as a JPEG, you can go online and convert them. There are converters online. You can do a Google search for one of those. Or if it's at home, you can rescan them into a JPEG or do the same thing. Go to one of those converters. However, you do want them in JPEG format because this program won't bring in PDFs. To bring those in, we'll come up to File here, Import, Image, find your files here, Scans. I have 3 JPEG images. We'll start with the 2 that are actually that one part that I had to splice in half. So we'll bring in the first one here. And then we'll just go right back to File and import that second one. Image, Open. And to size these, we do have that mark on that pattern. And the cleaner you get and sharper those lines are, the better it is and easier it is to scale it correctly. So there's a couple of ways we can dial these in. First, we need at least one part that's good to go. So we need to come back up to View and turn our grid back on. So just to make sure it's still correct, I'll go back to View, come down to Grid Rule Bar Settings, and make sure we're still at that 1-inch gap, section by 8. And we can size these. So you can see it's quite a bit bigger past the 1 inch. It's like 1 3/8 right now. So we'll just grab one of the dots and scale this down until we get close. You can zoom in and check and use the arrow keys to dial that in just to get that line right in there. It's still a little too big. I have it set so I marked so the 1-inch mark is right in the center of these 2 lines. And the beauty of having it on one large page is you just dial that size in one time and you're good to go. Whereas if you have a lot of different parts and you're not careful, they can be a tiny bit different, but there's some things we can do to check and make sure we're good to go. That looks right on the nose there. You can see how much bigger that is. You can dial this second one in using that 1-inch mark, or I'll change the opacity down like 30% or something, just make it good and see-through. And before I flip that around and line it up, since I know this pattern is a mirror image vertically as well, I can just bring it in this way. Over the top of the old one. And really try to dial that in. But for the most part, I always just come in and use that 1-inch box. See how close it already is since we just brought it over the top to kind of get it there. But it is, I think, just a tiny bit big still. That looks like it should be good. Just to make sure, I'm going to turn the opacity back down and lay it over the top of this. And you can grab in the center of this picture that's been selected. In the very center, there's that X or cross. You can grab that and move that down so when we get these two dots lined up, that X becomes our pivot point. So when we zoom back out and grab close to one of these corners, or the edge here, if you come out away from it, you can see a little curved arrow pops up. Then if you click and hold, you can rotate it. And you can see now it's rotating on that axis we set. So that way I can just move it back and forth to make sure, yeah, those are definitely the same size. Just grab that, bring that back over here, and turn the opacity back up. So since we need to flip this around, we'll just grab and get that curved arrow again, rotate it, get it close. But what I'm going to do is grab that little plus sign again and bring it down to this corner. But you can see, since this is opaque, it's covering up the pattern underneath. So again, we do need to have that opacity turned down a bit so that we can see what's going on underneath there. And just get it close, rotate it around, eyeball it, and we'll dial in this side first. And since this was a cut line to splice that into two pieces, so that trace line is actually just outside of where we want these two to meet up. So we want this line going across to be overlapping itself. So instead of butting this up like that, we want to bring it all the way down so it's overlapping. And we'll put it down right where we know it's lined up already. And we can come to this side and rotate it. Since it's rotating on that axis on the other side, we know that side will stay aligned. And if it looks a little off, you can arrow key it to get it dialed in, and that should be good. So let's turn the opacity up just a little bit here. Okay, so now that that's sitting there, this top layer, we want to combine those two layers together. But it's kind of covering that up. So in order to erase, edit, and mess with that file on that layer, we need to change it into a raster layer. We're going to right-click that layer and go up to Rasterize. So that changes it so that now we can erase sections and edit that picture a little bit more. You can go to the selection tool and select the area you want to delete off of that, or just grab this eraser here. You can see as I move this brush size back and forth, the circle in the center of that screen gets smaller and bigger. So we'll set it to about there. It's like 120. The softness can come in handy when you're doing more art and things. For this, it's not that big of a deal. I usually leave it at a little bit soft so I can ease into stuff. The stabilization settings for pens and stuff, I'll talk about that later on when I just show you what the pens can do a little bit and how they can kind of come in handy. To make sure we'll be able to see that layer underneath that this one is covering up a little bit, we'll just grab the eraser, click and hold, and rub that section out right there, and come over here and rub that part out. And then we can turn the opacity back up, and it's not covering up that pattern underneath. So now that that layer is on top of this layer, and we want them to be combined into a single layer, the one above the other one, you'll right click and merge with the layer below. So now that's on a single layer. Make it a little bit easier for us to trace it and move it around. You won't accidentally separate stuff and cause more issues. So before I trace, I usually do like to leave the opacity down a little bit, just so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. To start tracing this, we're going to need a different layer. We don't want to start stacking stuff up on a single layer. That just makes more editing and problems later on. We're going to come here, click another layer. We'll call this final pattern. This will be where we do all our tracing and refinement. Again, we're going to click that figure tool. However, this has got curved lines on it, so instead of using this polyline, we'll go one down to this continuous curve. And again, it can be a fill line or just a create line. Make sure we're on just create line. These are the different types of curves that can complicate or simplify things depending on how much you want to dig into as far as what this program can do. But if we stick to just this spline function, that's really easy. Like I said, you just place your dots on the line and it will kind of clean it up just enough for you. Brush size, 5 is pretty good unless you're higher resolution on your file. Opacity, obviously leave that up so we can see it good. Medium, so blends it just a little bit and make sure we're on the dark. Now, before we start tracing, let's grab this and center it, because then we can do just half of this and then mirror it over. So we're going to go back to the scan that we have here. We can click this on and off to make sure we got that right layer. And let's grab that. And if you notice, this line that I drew on there, I'm glad I saw this, isn't the actual center. You can see this dot, and this stitch mark is the center of the pattern. I accidentally put it in between two stitches when it should have been right in line with that. So ignore that. This is the center of the pattern, right on that 1-inch line. And to straighten this entire thing out, we'll back up again and grab that little plus sign, or X cross, bring it down to that area, zoom in, and we'll place it right on that stitch that's already centered, and that will become our pivot point. Our pivot point is set. We got to follow that center line up, and this is our center line. And as we zoom, if we keep our cursor right where it is, it will stay on that same line. And it does need to come over a little bit because, again, this isn't the actual center. That line was put on there wrong. It's this dot right next to it. So I'll come over just enough. Click OK. Deselect the area. And now that's got right line on the center and straight up and down. This will make it a little bit easier on us. Let's grab the final pattern layer now. And we're going to go back to that curve tool, continuous curve. Let's zoom in. Start about right where that center line would be. You just go like 3/8 or a 1/2 inch at a time. The tighter the curves are, the more you have to put segments into it. If it's a straight line, you can go away as But you'll see once you lay one of these, click, click, and if you're starting to come around a curve, it kind of cleans the area prior up a little bit and gives it a little bit of a curve. So just by following that line and clicking like every ½ inch, it will clean those curves up for us. And there are other tools in this program like Illustrator has where you can set points and edit and all kinds of stuff, but I wanted to make this as simple as possible. You see, just keep following up. I know that line's straight for a while, so I can just come up and even hold shift. Well, it looks like it gets a little, it got traced a little funny there. So this is the first instance, and like I said, the better you trace it, the more refined those marks are for the 1 inch mark, the easier it is to dial this in after the fact. But so I'll back up. I know that kind of is coming in here weird. Back up and then take a look by holding shift. And it looks like that whole pattern might have got cut out just a tiny bit off. So I know from about here it's straight. This is about the halfway mark. I'll come up to about here and hold shift and lock that in and ease it back. And little things like that can be adjusted, and it's a good idea to print these off, test your pattern before if you're going to sell it. And then again here, I intentionally kind of messed this corner up to show you, okay, where do we even trace? I don't know. So let's say I just kind of guess. And then to finish a line, double click. So I know this corner and that spot is kind of weird. It's a little messed up. But for this pattern, since I know it's a mirror image across there, I can grab this selection tool over here and grab the part I know that was traced well, looks nice. And inside that selected area, go to Edit, Copy, Edit, and Paste. And you'll notice it just made another layer right above the one we were on of that copy we did. So if we click Scale and Rotate and grab it, it just copied whatever was on that layer inside of that box. Since it's a mirror image, we can take this, flip it, and line it up with that other side here. So we're going to flip it vertically with this button here, and then we'll drag that up. We can use our arrow keys to dial that in. And once you have it where you want, yeah, look how much nicer it made that corner. Okay, but I'm not going to deselect that area yet. I'm going to switch back to the other final pattern layer that other line that's messed up is on. And since I still have that area selected, just hit backspace, and that line on that layer got deleted. So this is the main layer, and this was the copy layer we just made. And since there's nothing behind there now, we deleted that bad section of the layer underneath it. We will grab that, right click it, and merge with layer below. And now that whole line is nice and clean. It's a mirror image of itself. And we can do the same thing as far as mirroring it over to the other side. However, let's get all the stitches in and do that first so we're not having to redo all of that. Before we do that though, make sure again on that final layer, we're going to come over to the figure tool and we'll just grab a straight line, brush size 5, opacity, leave that 100. brush shape, make sure it's just a line. We're going to make these center lines real quick. The actual center lines, which would be right on this mark here. And again, hold shift, lock that in. So with the line, it's just click and hold, and when you let go, it places the line. Click and hold. And while I'm holding the mouse button, I hold shift, and it locks that straight. Let go of the mouse, and it lays our actual center line, not the one I messed up there. So, stitches. If they are traced good, it's pretty easy. If you have to work with them, or if you don't even have stitching on your final pattern here, if you have your pattern and on each part you make a mark that corresponds to the other pattern when you place them together, and you make a few of them, especially around corners, you can literally just fill in the stitches however spaced apart you want them. And as long as there's the same number of stitches between the designation marks that you made, they should go together pretty good. But I usually always like to have my stitches and everything figured out before. So with this, if you're punching a 1/8 inch hole, you want to make a black dot that's just a tiny bit bigger than that. Obviously, we're not going to be punching 1/8 inch holes for stitching. But with that said, figure out what size hole punch you want. Usually people go pretty small, and you want that dot to be just a little bit bigger, so when you're lining up your hole punch, you can see the ring around your hole punch. And for stitching, again, final pattern layer, we will use just the pen tool here. Pen and G pen is good. Brush size, so now this is, we'll mess with that in a second, but opacity 100%, you can have a little anti-lasing going. Stabilization is only important if you're using one of those pens on your tablet. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Figure out how big you want these to go. I usually go with like 12 to 14 works pretty good. And you can print, once you're done, you can print these off too and check and recheck and really dial stuff in. So with that G pen, it's just a single click. You can click and hold and it draws lines, but it's just going to be a single click. And as you go, if you have one of your holes traced weird, so it's like off, you can eyeball it and fix those things up. So we'll just undo or click Control Z to undo. If you decide you want to learn more about this program, you can actually design and make your patterns in this program. And when you're doing that, it's not quite as cumbersome when like doing stitches and stuff. It is time consuming, but I like to remind myself, just finish this up, and once you're done, make sure it's done really nice. Once you're done, it's good to go. You can share or sell that forever. Once you get all the way around with your stitches, you can turn off our scan here. And that's what we're left with, because that's on a separate layer there. So I'll come around, I'll finish all these stitching holes, and then I'll grab and trace that other part and show you how you can dial that in a little better by using this as a template for the other one. Oh, okay, so you see, that's another reason to leave that scanned layer at like 50% opacity, because I forgot to just switch back to my final pattern layer, and I went and put a dot down and it graded out. So then I saw right away, oh, I'm on the wrong layer. And I'll tell you, it's happened to me a couple times where I've done a bunch of work and it was on the wrong layer, so you have to go back and redo it. But with that, I saw right away, so I'm not creating any extra work for myself. Final pattern layer. Every once in a while as you're working, it's a good idea to come up here and give it another save as, and just up that number on the end there one notch. Always throw that 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. That way it keeps out everything. If you mess something up real bad, you can always go back. If you keep saving over the same file, you could mess something up. I know I have. You can see a couple stitches here are kind of back and forth a little bit. So I'll take a look at that grid, back out a little and make sure, yeah, they need to be straightened a little bit so I can compensate a little bit as I'm putting these down. Straighten them up. Now that that half is done, let's just grab the selection tool, rectangle, put the selection tool over that, and we're not going to grab it to move it around or anything. We're just going to go back up to edit, copy, edit, and paste, and you can see it just made another layer down here. And we'll grab that to move it, but first let's flip it horizontally, and then we can come in here and move it around, and I'll back out so you can see that we have this whole separate layer. It was just that other side mirrored. Okay, we'll zoom in, get it close. We're lining up those two center marks right there. Hit OK. Get rid of that selection. And then we want to combine this layer with this layer. So we'll click the one on top and merge with the layer below. Now we have that final on that same layer. And let's grab another part, and again, I haphazardly cut this out and traced it a little bad so I can show you how you can fix some of these mistakes. Now, you want to trace it as best you can. You want to put that 1-inch mark on there as clean and sharp as possible. It'll make this a lot easier. However, if you did make a mistake and there are some discrepancies, we're going to go to File and bring that in. So File, Import Image, and it's this other scan here. Let's just decrease that opacity right away to like 50. You see, that's huge. So let's straighten it up, and I'm looking at the 1-inch mark. I want that to be straight, not the part itself. Straight horizontally across, so it's better to dial in the correct size here. A little small. Still kind of small. Just take your time, make sure you get this really dialed in. Tiny bit small still. So now that we have this in here, you can lay it over the top of your other pattern parts to check the sizing and stuff. These holes won't match those since these two parts don't actually sew together. The holes are a little different. However, the sizing should be the same. So I can just trace this and check, or I can come over here, make sure I'm on that final pattern layer, and this scanned layer, let's drop that down below that final pattern layer. So I'm on the final pattern layer. Let's grab a selection tool. Another cool tool is the selection pen. So basically like a marker, whatever you color on is going to be selected. And you can see, and I let go, that's all a selected area. So what I'll do, let's turn this brush size up a little bit. And we're going to grab the border. Let's turn the scan off and get rid of that. So we're going to grab the border of this. We don't need the stitch holes like I said. And you can just go outright and just trace all the parts like we just did. I'm just showing you this in case you want to refine it and make sure two of your parts are identical. You can just grab this whole thing and mirror it over, but I just want the lines here. So that's selected. We'll go edit, copy, edit, paste. And now we can grab and drag that over here. And we know this part is straight up and down. It's perfectly vertical. Lay that over the top of this one. I'm going to line that center up again with a 1-inch mark. And just leave it right there. And if these lines, if the cut lines get in your way a little bit, you can just turn those off for now. So let's go back to the scanned layer that we need. Then we'll grab the operation tool, which allows us just to grab that singular item, move it around. And it was kind of dialed in here on the bottom at least. Pretty close. Let's go find that little mark in the center of the page. We had moved it around earlier, so it might still be in an awkward location. If you zoom way out, usually you can spot it. Yep, here it is. So we'll bring that down here. Right on that center mark. And then we'll take a look from this center. We have it at the bottom centered right on that line, that 1-inch line right here. And you can see this whole thing is kind of turned a little, so let's straighten it up. And you can see the pattern was a little bit small because, like I said, I cut it out just on the inside of the line instead to show you what happens. We'll dial that in as best we can so that it's directly in between those two lines that we pulled from that other part. So the only difference is, excuse me, the only difference is that it's a little narrow on these sides as it gets towards the top here. So instead of just straight up tracing that back panel, we will for the stitching holes. But now we know it needs to come out a little bit, and we'll use those lines as the tracing for this. We still have, this is a copy that's still not a part of that final pattern layer. I'll show you quick. Final pattern layer, and this is that copy we made of this part. So let's just combine those quick. Go to the top one, merge with layer below. So all our tracing's on the same layer. I like to try to combine things as I go. Otherwise, it can get pretty messy on the side there with just so many layers. So again, we only need to trace half of this part. First, let's go back to our straight line and give us a center mark right here. Hold shift. And then continuous curve. All the settings should be the same still. 5-point line, 100% opacity, a little bit of anti-aliasing, black. And we're coming from this one. We'll just continue on from what we had. So you can see coming around is weird. So I'll right click, get rid of that. So let's just come up to here and double click and end that line and then just start a new one. Double click again. And the other, you could use the polyline or even the straight line. But most tools can be interchangeable to some degree. I just kept it on this because we got these curves coming up here. So you can see this got cut in a little bit right here. It comes in. So I'm just going to go straight down to where it straightens back out. And that'll clean that one up. Hold the space bar so we can grab and drag that around. And if we go too far, it starts to mess with that curve a little. So I'll go just enough so it looks nice and rounded. And that's that half. And we can grab that section with the selection tool over here. And the tools on the subcategory change, so sometimes it's hard to come back to this bar and find them. But if you pan over it, selection tool, and we'll just grab that, edit, copy, edit, paste, select it. And now we have that copy section. We're going to flip it horizontally and line up these two center marks. Again, the arrow keys. Right there. Okay. And there's that. So now we know that will match perfectly with that other part. Either way would work, but I always suggest printing this off and refining it one more time before, if you're going to sell it especially. A lot of times I like people to use my products for a while and then I'll refine a pattern. But we'll do all those holes. These are rivet holes. And I'll do this part. We'll get everything traced in here. I have all my pattern parts in here, added my text, cleaned up the lines and things like I was just showing you. And you can grab these and bring them together and check to see if stuff's aligning. It's always good to print it off and do another test of your pattern itself in leather. You can see I added these rulers and my copyright page with like instructions on how to print it and things. And basically all that is, this is a picture I imported. As far as text goes, you'll grab the little text icon down here, and it can be too small or too big. You can click on the page, give it a test. If it's all right, hit escape, it'll get rid of that. So then you can dial this in a little bit, decrease the size a little, click on your page, give it a test, hit escape. That's pretty close. So to number your pages, which is very helpful, and then once you have it typed, if you scroll over the edge of this, you can move it around. And I'll do that for all the pages. That makes it so much easier to cut and piece together. This pattern doesn't have a whole lot of pages to piece together, but there are some where it's almost impossible without doing that. There's all my page numbers. And the ruler, that's just kind of another one of these where you use the graph or the grid here and you just follow those lines. And I, again, like this polyline tool. Figure, polyline tool, all the settings as before. Make sure you're not on that dashed line and you're on black. You can put this in the layer with the cut lines. You can make your own separate layer. We'll just go up top here and then make a layer on the very top. Call it measurements. So with this, usually 2 inches is pretty good. 1 inch is fine, but and just like when we made that little template when we first started, right in that corner, let's go 2 inches. Zoom in, hold shift so it's straight, go right on that line. So then we can come straight across and it's right in the center of that line. And we'll go 2 inches again. Right on the line. And now let's come up a little bit. And then over here, like 3/8 is pretty good. And then as we come in, we can decrease it. You know, this is the 1 inch mark. We'll go up 3/8 like we did before. And in between for the 1/2 inch, we can just go up 2 or one of these. and so on. And we'll add each one of those little marks, and you can decrease the size of it by 1 or 2 over here. You can see my smaller lines are a little bit narrower. But I always like to do both metric and the US measurements on each pattern. You never know who's printing it off, and then that way that's one less thing you have to do later on. But you can make 2 separate ones, one for A4, one for the US printers. So the last thing I do before I PDF this for printing is you're going to be bringing all these in so that they fit on as few pages as possible. Looks real nice, first of all. But we want to decrease the size of this page. So go up to Edit, change Canvas Size. Let's bring that up right close to the line. We're going to zoom way in. And I like to go just on the other side of this cut line, so those dashes don't show up on the edges of the paper where there's nothing on the other side. Hit OK. And the bottom of that's brought up. And then now let's bring in the side. Edit, Canvas Size, real close to that dash line. Bring it just to the other side. So that's basically our pattern there. I still like to do one more save in Clip Studio format. File, Save As, leave it at Clip Studio format. Put it in the right folder. Increase the number 1. Now I have that backed up. We can come back, edit any one of these layers, change something. If you come back and there's a mistake somewhere that you find, makes it so much easier. So in order to get that little printing template, it's good to have on the first page a picture of the whole pattern. It's helpful. Even though the pages are numbered, it's good to do this. We have that Clip Studio save already. First, we're going to flatten the image, which puts everything on one layer. You don't have to put it on one layer before you convert this into a JPEG, but I've had issues in the past where I didn't do that. I just converted it to a JPEG because technically that's supposed to put it all on one layer and make a JPEG. But I've had issues where I've printed it off and certain layers that weren't supposed to show started to show up, and it was weird. It didn't quite get it just right. So I always flatten that down to a single layer first. Save As. We just want to come here and switch it to a JPEG. Then, if we undo or back up until the pages are separate again, we can impose that and then save it as another Clip Studio. But the problem is the last format that you saved it as is going to be the default for what you save it as again the next time. So I always close that down because I've accidentally flattened my Clip Studio file, and you can still save it as a Clip Studio, but if it's flattened, that's where it's going to be. So I always close that down so I don't accidentally save my file, the new one, as a JPEG, or close it out. And then we'll just reopen, because we have that JPEG we just saved. We'll reopen the Clip Studio format version of this. So now by default, when we save this one, it will still be in the Clip Studio format. It's just a way for me to error-proof things. I try to do a lot of that when I make a mistake. Try to figure out what I could do in my steps to make sure I don't make that same mistake again. Anyways, now we have that JPEG and we can bring it in right here on our file. So we'll go File, Import, Image. We'll grab this one. I think that's the one we just made. And it looks like it's not even there, but that's because it's just over the top of everything. So we'll shrink that down until we get just inside this cut line. And then bring that down right here. Now when we print that alignment page off, they have a good idea of what they're doing. So now that's a nice little template set up right on that first page there. And again, I always like to make a lot of saves. Clip Studio format, 4.4, we'll just pop that up to 4.5, just in case we grab something or move something around on accident. You never know, mistakes happen. And that should be the final pattern. Now, if you want to add some watermarks, you can do that. There are PNG files that you can bring in, which can be laid over the top, because only where there's text and stuff that will show, it'll be translucent in the background. What I'm going to bring in is just another JPEG. It's a picture. The background isn't translucent, so you don't want that to go over this final pattern layer. It's just going to cover everything up. So let's bring that in quick. File, import image. It's in my patterns. So this is just a JPEG. All that white background is white background. And you can see which layers and where they are by how they're showing up here. And what I'll do is just grab that, drag that underneath my final pattern layer. So all those lines will be showing up. And I can decrease the opacity. I like to go down towards like 20-25%. That seems like a good number. Otherwise, where there's the black letters, it'll cover up stitching and make it incredibly hard to figure it out. You can decrease the size, grab it here and rotate. Move it around. And by having everything on separate layers, it makes it so much easier later on to just get rid of something if you don't want it. The other way to do this is just to grab your text, start typing, and this layer, right now it is on top of everything. It can go anywhere because everything in the background is translucent. So if we just grab this, sometimes it's better to come up and grab this operations tool. And with that on top, you can still bring the opacity down and you'll see all your stitches and stuff underneath. But before we get into converting these into PDFs, what I'll do is I'll go over how to refine tooling patterns. A little bit more finicky to do the tooling patterns, but if you're starting with a really good trace, that actually makes a huge difference. And if you just want to back up patterns, you got a good tracing with a finalized fine tip marker line, you can just bring that in, size it. You don't have to clean it up much at all. You don't have to do all these tracings. You have it backed up and you can print that off. You don't need to do all these extra steps. But if you're looking to sell stuff, it's really, I think, important to refine these down and get them really cleaned up. So tooling patterns, they're basically the same thing, but there's a couple extra things you can do, and you can do it with just your computer and a standard mouse. I'll talk about one of those fancy pens a little bit towards the end here as well. But let's just open up our file quick. So you see I have a section of a tooling pattern here, and I turn the opacity down, and we're going to use this as our example for our tracing here. So first we'll make a new layer, again final pattern, and on that layer we can use these tools like this continuous curve. If you go into your figure, continuous curve, like we were before. Line fill, just line. Want it on spline. Brush size 5 is good. Opacity 100%. A little bit of anti-aliasing. And with this one, it's kind of the same thing. You grab a point and just follow along that curve. And let's say we do a curve and we accidentally like straighten it out or make a mistake right there. And then on top of that, we'll come down and I'll show you how to refine this line. With this, you can come in with one of these curves or just do the same thing with the other line. This curve can be kind of nice for a really big, gentle curve, because what that does, it's really nice. You click and hold, and when you let go, the line is placed, but you still have a third click to make, and you do that after you get that curve set in. So you can do that, click and hold, let go, and then set that curve where you want it. Let's undo that. Or you can do the line we were just doing, refine it. You can either erase that section first or wait and do it how I do it here, is you put the line in and then you come back with your eraser tool. Well, that's way too big. Click and hold. Just gently come up into that and clean that up. Same thing, I'm still on the eraser tool over here. Eraser, hard, brush size is 7.7, and that'll change depending on your DPI set for your file. A little bit of anti-aliasing. Now the brush density is how much, you can see it takes like one pass to erase that line. If we change that brush density all the way down to like 11, it leaves a little bit there, and you can go over it a couple times to slowly bring that down. And even more so, if you turn that down even more, it can take quite a few passes. But we're going to leave that pretty high up there. And this gentle curve, I think that spacing is right on that side. So in this case, I would come in and narrow it down a little on this side first, because you want those points to come down to signify where your swivel knife cuts ease up and stop. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it's something I like to do. And let's continue on here. We'll go back to the figure tool, stay on continuous curve. You can see all my settings here again. And this is a good chance to fix some mistakes. Let me see if I can find something that isn't quite smooth, or the spacing is just a little bit off. Maybe right here, this kind of comes and is just straight right there. Maybe it should come in a little bit more. That's a good chance to fix some of your lines a little bit. Remember, if you're placing it, you can right click to back up a space. This pen tool doesn't really work for a mouse because it literally is everything you do. It doesn't really clean itself up. Can be done, and I will use that pen, like let's say I want this to be a little more curved here. I can come in with the pen and just fill it in, almost the opposite of the eraser, just where I want it to come in a little. And clean the inside line is what I'm looking at. Clean that a little bit more. And get that nice. And then I'll come back with my eraser and get rid of the stuff I don't want here. So your other option, if you want to get into it, is one of these digital pens. Some people like just the pad that they draw on, similar to a pad on a laptop, but bigger. And they watch the screen, and when you hover close enough, like right now I'm just hovering, you can see where it is before you start laying lines. What I prefer is an actual monitor that you draw on. I have a Huion one I've had for many years. I actually went to school for graphic arts. And I like to be able to see where my pen is on the screen itself. Some people prefer not to see that. They think their hand gets in the way. Whatever your preference is. But if you're going to be using, like over here, I got my mouse again, over here on this pen tool here, if you're going to be using pens and stuff, and I'm back to here, drawing with this pen, it can be smoother but you have to really watch those lines. So what I'll do, here, let's get rid of all this mess here. What I'll do is zoom in a little bit more. It helps. And you, with the pen too, you can hold space and then you can drag it. What I'll do is come over to stabilization, and usually it's somewhere in the middle here, and I'll show you if I'm drawing and I have a little bit of wiggle in my line, it looks pretty jagged and weird. The stabilization kind of gets rid of some of that jaggedness, the shake that you might have while you're drawing your lines. So if we turn that stabilization all the way up, it's a little bit more latency, but you can see I'm even kind of wiggling it, and it cleans that up quite a bit more for me. It also has pressure sensitivity, so you can like work your lines up. So let me show you where this really comes in handy for me. I'll be on the pen tool, and if I'm trying to get one of these lines situated, just like we were doing before, working up the line a little bit until I like the curvature on one side or the other. Then I'll go back to my eraser. And this is where I find it really helps, because you can just kind of ease up towards the line. And it's pressure sensitive, so if you're just lightly going, it does a little bit. If you press harder, it'll do more. And you can just clean your lines up a little bit easier. Like I said, I prefer the other monitor, but what's nice about holding a pencil or something in your hand is when you move your wrist, it has that natural arc to it anyways. So with this, what's nice, if you hold shift and scroll your mouse wheel, you can rotate it. So you can place this right where you need it to be in order to hit that nice arc. Let me switch back to a pen and show you here. Just naturally wants those arcs. Which can come in handy. But like I said, especially if you're tracing patterns, the mouse works great. Whenever I'm designing patterns from scratch, tooling patterns that is, I really like to grab one of my pens and hit my graphics art monitor. So there are a ton of features that this program can offer. Pencils and paints and blending techniques, and if you want to just mess around with the art side of stuff a little bit more, it does so much. And there are a ton of videos on YouTube that go through everything step by step. This video was more for just digitizing your patterns without adding in all that extra stuff for you to think you might need to remember. However, you may find some other tools, some other things, if you watch some other YouTube videos or something that you like and you try, and maybe that works a little bit better for you for making your patterns. Works pretty good. A couple tips and tricks to finish everything off here. Let me get rid of this layer and we'll turn this one back up. So let's say you find this section too straight, or you want to just change the shape of it slightly. Instead of redrawing that whole section, you can come over here to the selection tool, and you can use the polyline to grab just what it is you want to alter. Let's just grab just this section here. And I'm just kind of going quick, so I might grab wrong pieces of it, but in between those two areas. Once you have that section selected, there's a couple different things you can do. If you just grab that and you hold Control, you can move just one point at a time, and it will alter the shape of that from that point, squeeze and manipulate it. So for instance, let's say I feel like that's just too big coming out. I would just grab this point and bring that in a little bit like that and shrink it down. Or if you want it to come down a little bit further, hold Control, bring that down like that, and you can rotate it a little. And you can also cut that section out and paste it on a separate layer so it's not causing any issues when you come back to this lower section here and try to delete stuff and make it match up. Another tool that can come in handy is if you want to fine-tune each section of that selected area. Come into Edit, Transform, Mesh Transformation. It creates a grid, and each one of those points acts kind of like what we had just done a minute ago. And we can grab each point. You don't have to hold any buttons down for this. Shrink that section down, stretch it out, move it around. Bring that curve out a little. Quite a few different things. Those are just a couple things I like to use here and there. Another thing I'll mention is sometimes you'll want to move these toolbars around, and if you click and hold up top, you can grab that whole toolbar. And this is where I usually keep mine, because I'm switching between tools, and usually this tool selected, the subtool, and all the settings are the same. I don't change those as often as I'm switching tools, so I leave all those here. And on top of that, there's quick keys for everything. But let's say I move this, or I accidentally close something out, I'm missing a tool, something's not right, this whole section is just messed up. Everything's moved around, not where I want it to be. If you're needing to reset everything, you can just go back up to Window, Workspace, Reset to Default. Boom. So that's happened to me a couple times where I accidentally move something or it gets deleted. Let's just go over quick how to transfer this over to a PDF format for printing. First things first is flatten the image. That way everything is on that same level. We'll change the canvas size. And what we want to do is bring it in, just pick one of the pages. Bring it in just outside of those cut lines. That way the cut line will print completely. And you want enough so that we have a little bit to play with as we line up each page. You'll see here in a second. So that's good. Maybe a little bit more on this side, just to be safe. So first thing I do is switch to this tool here, the operation tool. That way we can just grab and drag, and that whole file is saved. So we can just bring it around, position it in this window basically that we created. And we just go one page at a time, bring it in so that cut line is just to the inside. Save as. Let's create a folder. Called Paged Pattern. Switch it to JPEG, page 1. I get it close, and then you can use the arrows again to just dial that in. Save as, page 2. File, save as, page 3. And we'll just go through and get every one of these pages on here. And you can see the page gets kind of cut off. It's showing the background here. You don't have to worry about that. That'll just be white when it goes through the PDF software. It'll maintain that exact same size regardless. And that's it. So So what I do is I'll just leave this in this state. I won't mess with it. That way if I have to come back in a second here, you'll see it'll be the exact right size. Because if you come back and try to just fix and do just one page, it's not going to be the exact same size, and that can actually affect some people's printers, especially if they don't click all the functions they're supposed to click. A lot of times it'll still print out just fine, unless of course we do what I just said and come back and make separate pages at different times. So we'll just minimize that page and go into the paged pattern and just check here. There's 12 pages. 1, hit the arrow keys, 2, 3, 4, 5. Make sure everything's on there. Good. That'll be fine. Now we know we can close this. So that will be the paged format. And I'll show you what to do in the PDF software here in a second. So now I'll show you how to do the larged format, how to just make that. I mean, obviously that's pretty easy, but open it up. Same thing as before, but before we flatten the image, we're going to want to get rid of those cut lines because we don't want those on there. I have it on the same page as my little ruler setting. So what I'll do is I'll leave that on, make sure it's rasterized. And instead of trying to select everything else, I will select what I want to stay. And then this little button here inverts the selected area. So then we can just get rid of that. So there we go. Pattern, full page format. Chances are it will have to flip and be printed the long ways, but you can do that on a 26-inch printer, I believe, whatever this measurement is. Now, we'll flatten that out. Save as. Make sure we swap it to a JPEG. Final pattern, large format. So we can close that and we can open up our PDF software. And this is Kofax Power PDF Standard. It's what I use on my other computer. I didn't want to pay for it again, so I have a trial going, 15-day trial, I think. So if you want to check this one out, 15-day trial. I like it because it's real easy. There are cheaper ones out there, and there might be some free ones. I actually never looked up if I could do exactly what we need to do here. Potentially could. So, go up to File, and regardless of the software you're using, you want to combine multiple files into a single PDF. This will be for the paged. Add files. So, paged format, pages 1 through 12. Open, and that will convert them. Combined, and make sure it's in the right file. Paged pattern, save. And we can open files to take a look here. Back this out a little bit. Looks like they're all good. And when you print that off, if you print true to scale or 100%, I do mention that for anybody that buys my patterns on this page here, how to do it. But they can print just the first page, check their measurements, and that's that. So let's close that one. Create a PDF from a single file. This will be the large format. So there's our paged version right there still. We'll go back to here. Final pattern, large format, open. And this is the file that you would bring to Office Max, or you would send it over the internet to a company if you're having a bunch of these printed off or something like that. And with this one, it doesn't automatically save it after it combines the files. You have to go in and do it manually. Save as. We'll browse and make sure we get it where we need it to be. I'll just leave it right in that same folder. Save. So there it is. Now it shows a bunch of extra white. That's not a part of that. That's going to go away when you have it printed like it shows on the side here. All right, we should be good. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. Hopefully this is easy for you. I like this program. I can do all kinds of different stuff with this. If you go onto YouTube, there's a lot of different tutorials talking about all the different tools this has to offer. It's a really cool sketching program if you like to make comic books, things like that. It's wonderful. If you really get into this one for tooling patterns, I do suggest getting a monitor that you can draw on. Huion makes a really good one that's not as expensive as the top name brands, but that way you can have your pen, stylus pen, and you're drawing right on the monitor where you see. And the beautiful thing about that is I can make a few lines and back it up, back and forward. So many different layers. It's, to me, a lot easier than trying to draw these out on paper. A lot more user-friendly. Thanks for watching. If you want to take a look at any of my patterns, portfolio, my website, TonyAllenBernier.com. I got a lot of stuff on Etsy and YouTube and things like that too.